Good evening. Thank you for joining our Bluetongue virus update webinar this evening. This is the fourth in our series of fortnightly webinars. Worth mentioning that the next one will be held on the 21st of February. So you can register for that in the usual way. Tonight we have Gordon Hickman from Defra joining us to give an update on the current situation with regard to the virus. Unfortunately, the chair of tonight's webinar, Joe Henry, president of the Sheep Veterinary Society, is unable to join us as he has had some problems with electricity in his valley. He was on the call earlier, but he suddenly dropped out, so he is unable to join us. So I work for AHDB, so I'm just going to be chairing this session this evening. So if I just take you through some housekeeping, if I can go to the next slide, please. So just to let everybody know, the webinar has been recorded. These are then posted onto YouTube, and everybody is welcome to access those. All the previous recordings are on YouTube as well, so please do go back and have a look at the webinars if you haven't seen them. Each one has got some a different topic as part of the webinar session, so they're designed to be informative and help give you background information on Bluetongue and Schmallenberg viruses. So what we'd like you to do, please, is put questions in the chat as we go along. We may not be able to answer all those questions, but we will get to them in later webinars if we can't answer them this evening. And here's some detail on how to ask the question. So you'll see there, click on the arrow in the orange box, and then click on the white arrow to open the question box, and then type in your answer. And all these are captured by us at the end of the session, and we go through them to just check what people are most interested in, and that's then helping us inform us with regards to what topics we should be covering in future webinars. So tonight, as I mentioned, we've got Gordon Hickman, who's the head of exotic disease policy at Defra. He is going to give a short presentation, and then he's available to answer some questions. And then we're going into a recording of a meeting that was held pre-Christmas with vets from the Netherlands, where they talked about the Bluetongue situation in the Netherlands, how they had been dealing with it, and go take you through some of the clinical signs of Bluetongue, what they saw in their lamb and beef populations, and then a bit more into sort of how the disease spread across the Netherlands. So if I hand over to Gordon, please, he's got some slides to present as well.
Well, good afternoon or good evening, everyone. Thanks for inviting me along. I have been to a couple of these before. So this is just a very short update on the latest situation, and perhaps just a little bit about some of the recent announcements that we've made in terms of some of the relaxations on the movement restrictions. I don't know if we've got any slides coming up. Maybe not. At least I can't see them. So in terms of the latest situation, those of you that have signed up for text alerts and keep an eye on the gov.uk will be aware that as of this morning, there were 85 infected animals, in all of them in England, all of them in Kent and Norfolk and parts of Suffolk. That's 80 cattle and 5 sheep. Still don't think we've got slides, so I'll just crack on. And that's on 46 different premises. And when we say premises, that's locations. That's 33 different keepers in those areas. And it's split roughly 50-50 between Norfolk, Suffolk and Kent. We've got those 2 temporary control zones in place. You'll know that both of them started off originally as 10-kilometre circles around the first finding, and then we've just extended those zones depending on where we found animals, and where those animals had clearly never been grazing within the temporary control zone, we've extended those zones. Still true to say that there's no evidence of current circulation in the midge population, and so these animals were infected some time ago, because all of the animals that we found to date have been PCR positive, so there is virus there, but they've also been seropositive, so that shows that they've already mounted an antibody response to that infection. So they're all older infection. I suppose since the last seminar or webinar, the most significant change is that we're now in what we're calling a seasonally vector low period. So that means that midges are not only not active, but also the temperatures are sufficiently low that any infected, or if an animal were to bite an infectious animal, the virus is not going to replicate in the midge, and so is not going to be capable of transmission. So that does mean a significantly reduced risk of transmission, which means that we're able to relax quite a lot of the restrictions. It's still true to say that all movements into, out of, and within one of those temporary control zones does need to be a license, but it means that we've been able to license many more moves than we were able to. Just put up there, I know you know all of this already, but Bluetongue affects ruminants and camelids. Whilst we haven't seen clinical signs in any of the cases that we found to date, as you'll probably hear in the next session, that is quite different from the situation that's been found in continental Europe, and in particular in the Netherlands. And this disease can cause milk reduction, sickness, reproductive performance, and mortality as well. And some cases, particularly in sheep, those mortality rates have been higher than we would have normally expected. It doesn't affect people. Meat and milk are safe to drink, just want to remind people that, and it is spread by biting midges. But germplasm is also a risk, as is infected blood. And I think at the moment our biggest concern is the risk from entire males that may have been infected, and so can pass it on in semen, and also in pregnant animals that have been infected, and so we can get maternal transmission. And so we're worried about calves and lambs and kids being born infected, and so could move disease around the country. So hence we're still keeping those restrictions in place. Next slide. So now we're in this seasonally vector low period. I think I probably said the bit about the risk from biting midges, but that's led us to two things. So firstly, in almost all cases, and I think all cases since we announced the start of the seasonally vector low period, we're not culling those infected animals. And that's because even if they were to be bitten, well, it's unlikely they'd be bitten because there aren't any biting midges flying, but even if they were bitten, we're not going to get that risk of virus replication. So we are still taking mitigation measures. So those infected animals will be placed under restriction, and if they are pregnant females, we will test the offspring once they're born. But that's a significant change. And I guess the other more practical thing, and where it will hopefully ease some of the hardships on keepers within the zones, we're able to allow many more moves. So I guess the most important one is the ability to move live animals out of the zones, but it is subject to a pre-movement test. And when we mean a pre-movement test, what we're saying is that any samples taken on or after the 18th of January count as a sample or a test, and those samples need to be tested by PCR and ELISA. And if they're negative for both PCR and ELISA, then those animals are free to move. They can go to a premises, they can go to a market, they could even go to an abattoir or a slaughterhouse, and they're free to move thereafter. The other things that perhaps I should say, what happens if they're not PCR negative? So if they're PCR positive and seropositive, then that's a positive case and they'll be put under restriction and won't be moving. If they are PCR negative but seropositive, each individual animal is looked at on a case-by-case basis. And again, if they're not entire males or pregnant females, we're likely to be allow those animals to move. The other changes that we've made in terms of licensing, so we've now allowed during this lower risk period movements from markets into the zone. Again, that's been a frustration for keepers. I know that they haven't been able to source from markets. That's now possible, and what we've asked is that you get a bill of sale that identifies the animal IDs that you bought. We don't need to know how much you paid for them, but we just need to know those IDs, and those need to travel with the animals, and you need to send those details to APHA licensing team within 24 hours of the move. That'll all be listed on the license, but we're not requiring you to sort of phone up and amend your license before you can move them. So that movement from market into the zone can be either to a premises or it can be to a slaughterhouse in the zone. And the other relaxations are that we've allowed general licenses within the zone as long as they're to the same status in terms of their Bluetongue surveillance. So if you've had your Bluetongue statutory surveillance samples and you want to move them to someone else that's also had theirs, then that can be done by a general license. You obviously need to follow the restrictions, the conditions of that general license, but you don't need to apply for a license from the licensing team. And you could equally move from a premises that hasn't had that surveillance to another premises that hasn't had that surveillance. We do get asked, why is that, and why can't you just move anywhere? But our exit strategy for these zones is to make sure that we understand the disease situation, and if we start jumbling up animals that have been tested from animals that haven't been tested, it makes it very complicated to work out how much of the surveillance we've completed. The final slide I've got there is just a reminder that if any of you are private vets and are doing that sampling for your clients as part of a pre-movement test, we would just remind you that these are things you know about already, but particularly if you can make sure that the individual animal IDs, firstly, that they do have individual animal IDs, and that's not pink spot on left shoulder, even if it's with a permanent marker. It has to be a proper, unique animal permanently marked ID in the normal livestock movement ID criteria. And if just reminder to put them very clearly on the sample submission form so that we can tie them back. because that's important in terms of the agreeing the license. If you can also put TCZ move on the top of the form, that means it'll get prioritized over and above any of the routine surveillance. So that'll get tested, go to the top of the queue, and please make sure that those samples are properly packed in the normal sort of sample submission boxes, so that there's no risk of, we don't want them in jiffy bags and sort of Amazon boxes, and they should be clearly marked with those standards, and obviously to send them to Pirbright. So I think, Sheila, that's really my update. I think someone did ask how many samples have been taken. So we're very nearly at 36,000 samples having been taken in those two zones, and certainly by the end of next week we'll be substantially completed all the large commercial businesses. So we're, the team have done fantastically well to do that surveillance. So I'll stop there. There may well be some questions, but that's my last slide.
Okay, we do have some questions, Gordon. I think you might have answered some of them, but I will read them out. Are you finding seropositive but PCR negative animals?
So from memory, we've only found one seropositive PCR negative animal, and that was in an aged cow that was vaccinated for Bluetongue back in 2008. So I think that's the only one that we found that's PCR negative seropositive.
Okay, and are we able to certify live ruminants and germplasm produced during this period for export to the EU?
Only if the donors have been tested, and probably not to the EU. Actually, I'm not an expert on trade, so you'd need to look at the export health certificate. But most of those export health certificates do require the donor to have been tested both before the collection and after the collection, and so you need to get on a cycle of testing so that you can always certify on that program. But we do know that germplasm is being exported. I don't know if it's to Europe or not. I'm sorry, I'd have to look into that.
But I think your answer there really is that they need to be tested.
They need to be tested, otherwise you can't certify.
Yeah, and if they don't have the certification, then they can't move forward with it.
Yeah.
Okay. Next question is, what is going to happen with the animals which are not culled being positive when the temperature is over 12 centigrade? Is it not going to increase the risk of transmission with the hot weather?
So I think that the straight answer to that is there is no evidence of midge circulation. We know that typically speaking, these animals, even if you use the precautionary 60 days that WOA recommend as an animal being at risk, will have hit 60 days by the time we expect the vector season to start. So those animals won't be a risk for onward circulation. Now, at some stage, we may or may not get new midges coming across from continental Europe, and that'll be if you like, a new set of scenarios. So we're comfortable at the moment that we don't expect the seasonally vector low period to end until sometime during March and April, and that'll be 60 days after the start of the vector low period.
Okay, next question. What insect repellent would you advise for use on sheep to protect them from midges?
As you can imagine, I can't recommend individual products. So you all need to look at the list of HSE approved repellents and insecticides. I think all the available.
I suppose the question there really is insect repellent of use against midges. I mean,
So I think that's a different question. So we know that repellents only work for a few days, and so as a long-term measure, it's not going to be effective, but it might be effective if we were moving them to slaughter, for example. That would be a way of managing the short-term risk. But as a means of preventing disease, control and spread, it's not going to be effective because it's just not practical.
Okay. And then a question on how much testing is going on outside the temporary control zones.
So we've got the annual survey, which is coming to an end. So I think we probably spoke about that before, but we do an annual Bluetongue survey in the high risk counties. So that's Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, East and West Sussex, Hampshire, Isle of Wight, Devon, Dorset. Most of I think the Devon, Dorset, Hampshire, Isle of Wight bits have been completed and they're all negative. There's a few more to be done in Norfolk and Kent, maybe one in Essex as well. So that's ongoing. We've obviously got normal passive surveillance. So we're doing quite a lot of testing of what are almost certainly going to be Schmallenberg lambs, but where there is cavitation at post-mortem, we are testing them as well. So those are being tested. Any tracings off premises where we found infected animals, we're tracing them. And I know that's a frustration to farmers who get affected by those tracings, but we're testing those animals as well. Where the animals perhaps have already been culled, we're having to do a risk assessment or sample the remaining animals on those premises. So we have done quite a lot of testing from traced animals. We've also looked at those animals that move further afield from those areas, but before the zones were put in place. So from the 1st of September through to either the 11th of November or when it was the 8th of December that we put the Norfolk one in, those animals have been traced and we're starting to sample. We've sampled all the long distance ones, and now we're starting to look at the 100 to 150 kilometer distance ones, and then we're just working our way back in. So quite a lot of testing, but I do accept that we haven't sampled every animal in Kent or Norfolk in the vicinity of those zones.
Okay, moving on to another question now. This is quite a long one regarding live animal movement. Is there an update regarding movement of live animals into Northern Ireland from mainland Great Britain out with the TCZ zones? And because there are still a large number of animals purchased at pedigree sales who are stuck in lairage across mainland GB, unable to move into Northern Ireland. And Defra have been slow in any updates, and with Defra now relaxing control measures due to the seasonal midge populations, will there be a response to animal movement into Northern Ireland?
So it's,
sorry, is there any recommendation? Oh, and then there's another question, so sorry, I'll stop there.
So, the straight answer is that there's no update. The situation is as it was. We have lost our country-free status. I know options are being looked at, but no, there's no update, I'm afraid.
Okay, I've got another question about insecticides and insect repellents, but you've already answered that. And then a question about, presume the affected animals should be treated regularly. Who's going to monitor that the farmer is following the right procedures with those positives which are not culled? Yeah. So infected animals that haven't been culled, how are they going to be treated, and are we monitoring that?
So each case depends on its circumstances. Obviously, those animals and the premises are under restriction, so there is only so much you can do. APHA and local authority obviously are the enforcement bodies there. So there may well be the opportunity, if they are beef animals, for example, they're almost certainly to be allowed to go to slaughter for human consumption at the appropriate time. If they are pregnant, then we're obviously going to mark those animals forward, and we would ask that when they calve lamb kid, that we will then go and test those offspring. Obviously, if those offspring test negative, then that effectively lifts the concern over those animals. Bulls are more of a problem, and we wouldn't advise anyone to use a bull that's PCR positive, because you do risk, or a ram for that matter, because you do risk infecting anything you serve with that animal. So I don't know if I've answered the question, but
there's another question now about how do you look after a sheep with Bluetongue to get it over the virus. So I suppose that's really a question around mortality.
I mean, I think you need to speak to a vet about that. Obviously, none of the animals we've seen so far have had overt clinical signs, but we do know from the Netherlands that some of those clinical signs are severe, and they don't always recover even with appropriate care.
Yeah, I think the presentation
from our perspective, a positive animal will be treated in the same way as a positive cow, in that it'll be placed under restriction. If it were a male, it would remain under restriction for a bit longer, and then we'll test any lambs that are born.
And then a question about transmission. Do midges get the virus from infected animals when they bite them?
So yeah, so that's the route of transmission. Yes, so midge bites infected animal, and that's how the midge acquires the infection. Then it has to go through the replication process, which is temperature dependent, and then it then goes on and bites a naive animal,
and passes on the infection.
And then passes on the infection. And that midge, once infected, is infected for life. Now, fortunately, they have a relatively short life, and so what we're hoping is that all the infected midges will have died by the time the weather warms up. But there is a small risk, I guess, that you could get some sort of midge in some sort of microclimate somewhere, but it'll be very, very low. So our concern is, if you like, overwintering via bulls serving, infected bulls serving new naive animals and infecting them, or those calves or lambs that are born infected, if they're sufficiently close to the end of the vector load period. That's why we're worried about those particular types of animal.
Okay. There's a question about the deer population in Kent and Norfolk. Would it act as a reservoir of the Bluetongue infection?
Yeah, you're probably not asking the right person, but I think.
I suppose the question there is, have any deer been tested as well?
So we haven't tested very many. I think we have at least one has been tested. We don't believe that they are involved as a reservoir for transmission, but clearly they are susceptible species and can get infected. So it's a possibility, but we're not aware that it's a major concern for transmission risk from all the work done elsewhere in the world, and didn't appear to be in 2008 either. So we're aware of the risk, but we're not actively going out doing surveillance in the wild population.
Okay. And then we have a question about so how long will the restriction on positives be kept in place, and what exit strategy is available apart from abattoirs?
So I think we're working through those options. I haven't got an answer for you this evening, but we are looking at those options. I think I've mentioned the 60 days where individual animals, as long as they're not pregnant or entire males, that's when they become lower risk. So those are the sorts of factors that we're looking at in the context of seasonally vector load periods, and when those relatively low risk period starts and ends. So we'll update you as and when we're in a position to advise.
And here's a question, I don't know if you can answer this one. Are there now sufficient slaughterhouses licensed to take fat hogs from the temporary control zones? So I suppose the question there is, the animal restriction movement just on cows and sheep, or does it extend to other animals? So pigs wouldn't be affected by Bluetongue.
So pigs not, but I guess we're talking hoggets rather than
fat hogs.
Yeah. So the straight answer is I don't know the capacities. We've got there's a new abattoir come on today that is further than 100 miles, but now we're in the seasonally vector load period. We're more relaxed about how far these animals are traveling. What we'd say is if any farmers or producers, if they're, please encourage your normal abattoir to become designated. We're trying to encourage every abattoir in the country to become designated, because we don't know what's going to happen, next summer. And as we've discussed before, but if we have circulating virus, we will put in place much bigger zones, and so that will mean more people are affected, and so we'll need to move to designated abattoirs. So please encourage your normal outlet to become designated. But if you want to know which ones are designated, if you go to the gov.uk Bluetongue page and look on the licensing page, there's a list of all the designated abattoirs there. I think there's 8 designated now. So we're better off, still like more.
Okay, and then there was a question about vaccines, but we are producing a separate podcast in response to the questions that we're being asked about a vaccine and its availability, or what might be happening with regard to producing one. So that is, we will publicise that podcast once it's recorded, and that should hopefully address lots of the questions that people have been asking.
Yeah.
So I think that is all the questions that I can see on the list. So if there's nothing else to add, then I think it's probably time to move on to the recordings of vets from the Netherlands talking about their experience of Bluetongue last year.
Thank you very much.
So, thank you very much for joining us.
I'm very honored. Thanks for the invitation and to share some information that we gathered after the start of the Bluetongue outbreak in the Netherlands, serotype 3. We do that with a lot of people. Some you're seeing here also today. Some are for the Dutch Food and Safety Consumer Authority, also from the colleagues from Wageningen Bioveterinary Research, and pathologists and epidemiologists from GD. This was the situation that we had at the beginning of September, the Bluetongue situation in Europe. And what happened, just briefly, the background, but I think that's for everyone familiar here. But I think it's always good to have the same situation where we start from, to see maybe already there can be some discussion sometimes, but we will see. A vector-borne disease, diverse in pathogenology, more than 30 serotypes, of which the first 24 are notifiable. Vertical transmission has been described, especially in live attenuated vaccine strains, but also for BTV8, and is also suggested as an overwintering strategy of the virus. All ruminants are susceptible. Disease also described in alpacas, cattle as the most important reservoir, and clinical signs are generally more severe in sheep. And there is limited to no cross immunity based on scientific knowledge between the serotypes. What happened in the Netherlands? We go back to Sunday, the 3rd of September, when 2 veterinary practices at the same time notify Bluetongue symptoms in sheep, and they notified that to the Dutch Food and Safety Consumer Authority, and also had contact with the GDV-kijker. Day after, those farms visited by a specialist team, a veterinarian from the Dutch Food and Safety Authority, and a GD veterinarian and a practitioner from the field. And they observed clinical signs, and but also in 2 of those farms, also cattle was present, but they didn't show any signs of Bluetongue. And at that time, samples were submitted to the reference laboratory. And the day after, it was announced that Bluetongue was proved to be there. And at that evening, Tuesday, a lot of questions arose, like how long is the virus already spreading? Inge will tell something about it. How fast will it spread? I will show something how it went in the Netherlands afterwards. We got a lot of questions from the farmers. But also, of course, we then likely are looking at the experience from the previous outbreak. The question arose, what are the clinical and pathological signs of this serotype in the Netherlands? And what questions about protection in the flock? Melle, I think he will tell you something more, because a couple of days after the initial diagnosis, then the Wageningen Bioveterinary Research announced that it was based on their own research, that genotyping, that it was serotype 3. What did we see in the beginning? This was one of the first farms affected. These are pictures from the 5th of September with sheep cooling their mouth. These symptoms were, for me, were more or less the same as I have seen in 2006, 7, and 8. And at that time, we also noticed hypersalivation, swollen head, very, very ill sheep. Here the hypersalivations, the mucosal membranes in the mouth that were affected. We did see in the eyes also swollen edema there, and the mouth, as you see. And at that time already, it was mentioned that there was quite some mortality in sheep. And in some cases, it was described by people as being more as what they were, that they had seen in the previous outbreak. So and also because there were questions about treatment, several animals were offered for post-mortem examination, and to see what were the main clinical signs. And what was very severe in the cases that we got for pathology, and we already published it, but it's all in Dutch, so I will do that soon in English, and not scientifically, but just to share it with you later on, because I think it's very worthwhile information. But what we saw was in almost all cases a very severe lung edema, and that was so severe that you could almost think about other vector-borne diseases, like by example, African horse sickness. And you see the microscopic changes in the lungs. And so one of the questions that was to be asked when you have sick sheep, are you going to treat them, or can you better euthanize them because the severe symptoms? That was the same in the rumen, very severe inflammations, and there we also saw that bacteria could enter there quite easily and could cause septicemia. And what we also saw here, you see a picture of the myocard, but it was also in other muscle tissues that there was severe degeneration. And that's also what we are currently seeing, because the pictures that I show of the pathology are already from September. But when animals recover, you see, as also has been seen in BTV8, severe degeneration of tissues, and it takes a very long time before animals recover, as if they recover. What we also saw was that that there was, in the cases that were offered for pathology, there was also kidney problems, and that was one of the reasons that for the animals, that when it was the decision was made that they wouldn't be euthanized, but they were treated, that to be very careful with non-steroid drugs, because the animals seem to drink very poorly, and then you got more risk of kidney failure. What we saw in the weeks after, when some of the first farmers mentioned that they were saying it looks like it's going a little bit better after 3 weeks and having less problems, and then suddenly it was not even a week later that they called and they said, René, we were too soon by saying that, because we now see very severe symptoms in the hooves and also in the knees and in the joints. And it might be that this is caused by the septicemia, but it might also be that it is from outside, and that inflammation because of lying. What you see on the left side is the knee, of course. And also animals with chronic infections have been offered for pathology. And in those cases, it appeared to be periarthritis, and not in the joints itself, but in the lower foot it was. But all these animals, what you see here, the severity of the clinical signs made that these animals are in many cases have to be euthanized. So this is a summing up of the symptoms that I just mentioned. What we have seen in goats, the signs are less severe as they are in sheep, but that was also what was to be expected. Although there are already over 40 farms with goats where the infection has been seen, and just as in all ruminants, fever is a predominant symptom. And here also the edema of the lips, bleedings on the udder. And we also got some animals for pathology, but the clinical signs or the pathological signs are less predominant as they are in sheep. In cattle, then we see also in this Bluetongue serotype, we see a lot of clinical signs, and also mortality has been seen, and it has also been described, and it's been investigated now in numbers. But maybe that's what her department is doing of the epidemiology, and that is a little too soon because that's not finished yet. But also here, the nose with the and on the severe problems in the claws, and that's also something what farmers and veterinarians still are mentioning at the moment, that they see a lot of problems with lameness in cattle. These symptoms are more or less the same as you also could have seen in the outbreak of the previous outbreak, but what we do see is that symptoms are described as more severe as previously. What we recently also have seen is what you see in the last line, and that's that BTV3 has been found in the spleen of stillborn calves. And therefore, I agree with Fiona that this is one of the overwintering strategies of the virus, and therefore that vertical transmission has been seen now, and that makes it very likely that there will be more in the coming months, and it might be a reason how the virus will overwinter. Something about the spread. Until so far, we started with an image where in the Netherlands, this is where it started. It was in the center of the Netherlands, so that was different from the previous outbreak when it started in the south. Although it was later on, it was suspected that it had started in Belgium, the BTV8 outbreak at that time. And I will click through it. And as you see, in the week's time after, the spreading went quickly. Also, other animal species involved afterwards, and mainly to the west, east, and the northern part of the Netherlands that the spreading went. I believe in BTV8 there was one description from Germany from alpaca with Bluetongue serotype 8. We have seen it several times on several farms. Also very animals that can die very suddenly. This is the picture of this morning. I apologize for the Dutch on the left, but what it says is the clinical positive ones. So there is now a possibility to notify to the authorities by sending in a blood sample that it will be investigated by Wageningen Bioveterinary Research. So that's Melle, his team, or that when a veterinarian sees clinical signs, that they only do the notification based on clinical signs. So that are the blue spots in this picture. Almost 6,000 cases already. And the many questions that we just mentioned, I think that during this presentation, some more answers are given, or preliminary answers are given. But in conclusion to this, I think that what we have seen were very severe symptoms in sheep and cattle. In sheep the most. We have seen a very rapid spreading over the Netherlands in the last weeks. And Inge will also tell something about the mortality rates.
Okay, so moving on a little bit with what did we see with regard to the impact, very shortly, because we have a lot of information, but I try to highlight for you what is most important. So first of all, well, one of the first questions we had when we detected the first cases is, did we miss something? Was it already spreading in August, and did we miss it? And what is happening? Are we still sort of, well, in our first cases? Or is it already widespread in the Netherlands? So that was the first question when we detected our first cases. So very shortly going back to that, because, well, what we did in that first week is we did an evaluation of samples that were submitted for routine testing in August to our company, to GD Animal Health. And what we did, we screened 1,000 sheep and goat samples, but also 1,000 bulk milk samples from cattle. And I will show you the results of the cattle because, well, we had the sheep and goat samples were on individual level and were only from 90 herds because, well, that was what we had at the time. But for cattle, we had 1,000 samples. So it gives a better overview of what was happening at the moment in the country. So we selected 50 samples per compartment. So to make sure, well, the Netherlands is divided in 20 compartments. And to be sure to have samples from all regions of the Netherlands, we did a stratified sample selection. And we selected samples from herds without imported animals because we were going to screen them on presence of antibodies. And antibodies are not specific for a serotype. And we know that especially in Belgium and Germany, they just regained their BTV8 free status. So we wanted to exclude animals from outside of the Netherlands to be sure that they did not encounter Bluetongue before. And at that moment, it's important to say that vaccination data was not yet available. So when we selected the herds for evaluation, we could not only select herds that did not vaccinate yet. So, and to show you on this slide, so the study was initiated on the 8th of September. That was on a Friday. And the first results had to be delivered on Monday evening, on the 11th. So over the weekend, we had to do this study. So that's to give you some insight on how it went. We had to go with what we had. But in that first evaluation, we wanted to test 1,000 bulk milk samples. In the end, we tested 991 because the other 9 were insufficient quality. And from these 955 tested negative for antibodies, 8 samples had a doubtful result and 28 samples tested positive. So that was what we reported on Monday with some additional details, but basically this was the most important thing. And then we said, well, we do not want to conclude anything based on this. We first want to include and correct for vaccination data. So on Wednesday, vaccination data became available. And then we had one other day because on Thursday we had to deliver our final results. So we combined vaccination data with the serological results, and this is what we found. And what you can see here in the first column is the bulk milk antibodies, negative, doubtful, or positive. And then you can see negative in the 2 columns after that, the 955 negatives ones, the 8 doubtful ones, and the 28 positive ones. And what was remarkable here was that there were only 7 herds from the 955 that vaccinated, but that tested negative. And if we looked in more detail, we saw that these herds vaccinated in 2017 or 18 and only once. And in comparison, the herds that tested doubtful or positive, on average, almost 60% vaccinated. And we also saw more recent vaccination evidence, so that they vaccinated 3 times in 2019, 2 times in 2020, 2 times in 21, etc. So here there was some clear evidence of vaccination. However, we were still, especially those 12, remained with, okay, but how does this happen? And is this official spread, or is this still evidence of vaccination in these herds? Well, in 3 of those 12 herds, we found that there were cattle present that were vaccinated in the previous outbreak. And what we know from our monitoring program that we run every year since we regained our free status in 2012, we will always detect antibodies. Even if the animal is vaccinated 5, 6, 7 years ago, we can still detect antibodies in those animals. So we thought, well, it may be that these results came out of the fact that there were still animals present that were vaccinated at some point. In addition, we had vaccination data, and that vaccination data in the Netherlands is quite complete for the most recent years, but it's not complete for the years before that. And even between the period of 2012 and 2018, we did not have any data at all. We only had data for the last few years, and even there is some incompleteness. So what we also did was we plotted the herds, the location of the herds on the map. And what we even saw was that these 12 herds were distributed similarly compared to those 21. So especially we found them around the borders of the country, around the borders of Belgium and the borders of Germany. So there was some suspicion that at least part of them still vaccinated, but we didn't know it. And these data were in the end analyzed anonymously, so they were encrypted. So we could not trace it back to individual herds to ask, for example. So based on this, our conclusion was that antibodies could often be linked to vaccination history. Vaccination records were incomplete. And there were also something to note was that there were no signals, no positive samples from the area that notified clinical signs. So based on that, we concluded that even though antibodies follow virus, we do believe that this study has shown that there was no massive spread yet of Bluetongue in August. And then moving on to, well, very short insight in impact. Here you see a syndromic surveillance results. So we look at deviations in milk production, and if there's a remarkable drop in milk production compared to the rest of the country or compared to earlier time, you can see a cluster, so a colored area. And what you can see in these maps is that from the end of September on, you see that the area is colored, which indicate a remarkable drop in milk production. And these are sort of indicative for 1 kilogram drop in milk production per cow per day for all the cows that were located in that area. So you can even imagine that cows suffering from Bluetongue-like symptoms, the drop will be immense. If you can see this on a sector level, then there is a remarkable drop. So on the other hand, what we also already did was have a look at mortality associated with Bluetongue in our sheep population. And in this picture, you can see the results over the weeks of the year. And here you can see on the y-axis the ratio. So we compared the mortality in each week to the mortality in the previous 5 years in the same week. So what you would expect is a ratio of 1. So a ratio above 1 indicates an increased mortality. So what you can see here is that since week 37, we have a remarkable increase in mortality in our country in sheep. And what you can also see is, well, these two lines that partly overlap are small scale and professional farmers, and here below as well. So there's no difference compared to, well, whether you are a professional farmer or a small scale farmer. And the lower two lines are the increase, representing the increase in mortality in lambs, and the higher lines are representing the increase in adult sheep. And here this decrease in week 44, it's sort of false because, well, at that point the data were still incomplete. So you can see from this picture that the increase in adult sheep was more remarkable compared to the increase in lambs, and no difference between professional and small-scale sheep farms. So, and then if you look at the time after notification of clinical signs, so this is the week in which clinical signs were notified, up to 8 weeks after clinical signs were notified, the light bars represent the mortality in normal years, so 2019 until 2022. The dark green is the mortality in adult sheep, and the dark blue is the mortality in adult lambs. And here you can also see this very remarkable increase in mortality every week after infection. So from this you can conclude that, well, mortality is increased immensely and for a longer time. And here after 6 weeks, it seems to reduce, but the number of farms already 6 weeks in the infection at the end of October was small. So we're not really sure of these results, whether they are real or just, well, based on the fact that there were only low numbers of herds in this situation. And then this is almost my last slide. So we did some further detailed investigation in 61 professional farms, so with more than 32 sheep that were already over 6 weeks in the infection at the end of the end of October. And what we saw here was that the mean mortality in these 61 herds was 25%, the median almost 20%. We observed a very large variation, and we think that the mortality is still underestimated because, well, the infection was not finished yet. And here on the x-axis, this represents the percentage of sheep that died, and on the y-axis, the percentage of herds where this occurred. So here you can see that there are even a number of herds that have over 50% mortality. And these are not specifically small herds. These can be very big herds with a large number of sheep. And the average of these, of all these 61 herds was they held on average 86 adult sheep. So they're not, well, they're not really big as well, but also not really small. So to conclude, what we found was that there was a clear increase in mortality in sheep. There was no difference between small-scale and professional flocks. we found a higher ratio increase in mortality of sheep as compared to lambs. And we found, and I did not present those detailed results, but we found that the highest mortality was visible in notification herds, but also herds that did not notify but were located in affected areas. We also found a clear increase in mortality in those. And in addition, but again, I did not present this, but up to the end of October, we did not observe a clear increase in mortality in goats. So, and had to wrap it up, well, we cannot investigate the complete impact yet, because we are still in the middle of the outbreak, and we first need to be at the end of this episode to calculate accurate numbers.
So thank you very much to everyone for joining us this evening. I hope you found the question and answer session and briefing with Gordon Hickman useful. If you do have any more questions, you can put those into your feedback forms at the end of the webinar. Just a few slides to remind you, there's a lot of information available on the Ruminant Health and Welfare website. If you haven't been there, please visit it. It's got lots of information, also information on AHDB's website. Simply Google Bluetongue, and that should lead you to our website and to Ruminant Health and Welfare if you can't remember the website addresses. There's also a hotline number which is aimed really at farmers. So if you want to share that number and any of these resources with your clients and farmers, that will help address any other questions that they might have. As I said, just put in some feedback if you need to. Our next webinar is on the 21st of February, and that is going to be on the topic of surveillance testing. So please join us for that and just join up. Sign up for that through the registration link. There's also a leaflet, again, aimed really at farmers. So if you want to download that from the Health and Welfare, Ruminant Health and Welfare website, you can do so, and print it out and hand it out to your clients. So it's just some details there of other organisations that you can point people towards for help if they're struggling. So, and finally, I'd just like to say thank you all for joining us. Good night.